What is the craziest war tactic used in history? During WW2, us submarine commanders were generally only allowed for war patrols out of fear that they would either become too ambitious or too cautious after too many patrols. However, CMDR Eugene Lucky Flucky of the USS Barb begged for and was granted a 5th war patrol. He then immediately asked that rocket launchers be fitted to the Barb. Already famous for his tactic of maximum harassment, Flucky became the first submarine commander to fire rockets at shore targets, but he didn't stop there, noticing a supply train on one of the shores he watched. Unable to use his rockets on it, Flucky sent 8 of his sailors ashore to rig a gom under the tracks. As the landing party returned to the Barb, the train set off the gom and was launched 200 feet into the air. This was the only time Allied forces landed on the Japanese home islands during WW2 and the only known time a submarine has sank a train. Flucky was a wild man though. On his way back to port without any torpedoes left, he was one sunk ship away from winning a bet, so he rammed the Barb right into it. TLDR, a wild man in command of a submarine blew up a train during WW2. He also attacked 2 convoys totaling over 30 ships and set the world record for submarine speed while fleeing pursuing ships after the attack. Easily the greatest submarine commander in US history. When the Anzacs pulled out of Gallipoli, they converted some of their rifles to be self-firing, using string to pull the trigger and water dripping out of a can for the timer, and left them behind to make it seem like they were still occupying their abandoned trenches. So for a few hours the Ottomans were defending against well-armed Beeftons. In WWI, the British airdropped opium-laced cigarettes on the enemy, and then when they started smoking and fell asleep they attacked the trenches. This happened twice. During World War II, Japan floated hot air balloons containing incendiary devices across the Pacific Ocean, hoping to start forest fires. No fires were started, but one did explode until a few civilians. The media was not allowed to report on it, which eventually led to Japan abandoning the tactic because they were hoping to hear results on the US news. The US wanted to release bats with little incendiary devices tied to them from bombers over Japan, with the hope that the bats would roost in Japanese buildings constructed from wood and paper and then ignite them. They nearly burned down an Air Force base in testing. Ultimately, the atomic bomb became ready sooner than the bat bomb, so it was never used. Canadians made spam a war crime. In WW1, Allies would throw spam to nearby German trenches. They would share it, ask for more, and more Germans would gather. Then we threw grenades. Technically, it's the is it food or a gum tactic that's now frowned upon. Iraq vs Iran War. Saddam electrified a swamp full of Iranian troops. Then took all the bodies and built a road across the swamp and used it to attack. Biological warfare. The earliest documented incident of the intention to use biological weapons is recorded in Hittite texts of 1500-1200 BCE, in which victims of tularemia were driven into enemy lands, causing an epidemic. The Assyrians poisoned enemy wells with the fungus ergot, though with unknown results. Civilian archers dipped their arrows and Roman soldiers their swords into excrements, and cadavers. Victims were commonly infected by tetanus as result. In 1346, the bodies of Mongol warriors of the Golden Horde who had died of plague were thrown over the walls of the besieged Crimean city of Kaffa. Probably not the craziest, but pretty creative. Even the USS Texas was assigned to the D-Day invasion. They find the cannons didn't have the reach to keep supporting the troops, so the captain ordered one of the torpedo blisters filled with water. This caused the ship to lean to one side, which increased the arch of fire of its older guns. Not exactly a crazy tactic, but Alexander the Great wanted to attack the island city of Tyre in modern-day Lebanon. It was a half-mile off the coast. Keyword was, they built a bridge of rock to get close enough to 4 archers, etc. Eventually turned it into a peninsula. 2,400 years later, it's still a peninsula. You're missing a couple parts in there. First they tried attacking from ships, but the walls were right against the coast and they couldn't land. They tried 1,000 things, but the defenders kept thwarting them. Try to set the walls on fire? They get covered with wet algae. Eventually they decided to build the bridge. It wasn't really for archers, rather for siege machinery and troops. But you can't just build a bridge like that. Where would you put the supports? They just started throwing sheet in the sea until it piled up high enough to reach the surface. And they built a bridge on top of that. All the while getting harassed by the defenders on boats and sheet, so they also had to build defenses along the way. And then, the bridge got destroyed. The defenders managed to set it on fire when they were a good way through. So Alexander started another bridge from the second best location, which meant it'd be even longer this time, and started again throwing rocks and ruins into the sea. And this time they made it extra thick and doubled up on defenses significantly. The whole siege was absolutely insane. Definitely worth a read up. Invading Rome on elephant back has to be up there. And still not the wildest thing he's done, strategically, Imo. The double envelopment at Cannae was ducking wild. Caesar built 2 ducking walls around a city while besieging it. Absolutely insane. Simultaneously besieging and being besieged. Apparently the outer wall was incredibly close to collapsing at certain points, but Caesar would run around on his horse and order troops to the correct spots at the correct times, even joining the fight himself at times to inspire his men. He was outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1. Also equally impressive is the speed at which his troops could build high quality walls well enough to keep the entire Gallic army at bay on one side and a city besieged on the other. That takes a shit ton of training. In the French Revolutionary Wars, a French cavalry unit successfully traversed the ice of the Frozen and held a harbor and captured the Dutch fleet as it was stuck in the ice. This was the first ever capture of naval units by a cavalry detachment. I vaguely remember a siege where a Chinese city refused to surrender to Genghis Khan, so he asked for a tribute of thousands of pigeons, rats, and cats as a token of respect in exchange for his departure. The city rounded up the various animals and delivered them, and he had his men tie wicks to all the animals and set them aflame before releasing them. The animals all fled back to their homes, setting the city on fire. Marines of Fox Company in Korea used their own dead as decoys for Chinese raids. Chinese would attempt to get close to what they thought were sleeping Marines and lazy sentries just to get filled with lead. Also, the one Chinese officer would speak fluent Chinese to make them think they came across friendlies. Seeger of Malta 1565. The militia took a dead Turk, replaced his head with a pig's head and tied the body to a post. When the Muslim Turks saw the body desecrated with filth of a swine, they rushed out in the open to recover the body, which was in a hill zone for an ambush. In North Africa, the British put fake maps in a jeep. It was driven by an English officer who had been giving secrets to his belly dancing Egyptian lover, who passed them on to the Egyptian Brotherhood, who in turn passed them on to the Nazis. The British found him out, and decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. They put the maps in the glove compartment, and instructed him to drive a certain direction. A gun planted in the jeep by the British held him, and drew the Germans' attention. They found the maps, which indicated smooth driving at a certain narrow pass, which was actually sandy. The German tanks got stuck, and were decimated by the British artillery hidden nearby. The book Bodyguard of Lies is one of the most fascinating war books I've ever read. The British in WW2 were amazing at deception. Inflatable tanks, trucks and fake paratroopers to make the Axis think D-Day was going to happen somewhere else. Hell, they still do that. Ukraine is doing it to the Russians right now. The new inflatables even have heat generators in them to give them an accurate enough heat signature. What we think of as war is really about logistics and projecting power. Getting people and goods to where they need to be is the most important aspect of a war. Everything else is just a series of inconsequential battles if you cannot project power and sustain momentum. To that end, getting food to the troops is paramount. An army marches on its stomach. To that end, one of the craziest tactics was done by Catherine the Great of Russia against the Ottomans. To feed the army, Catherine would issue bills of exchange to Ottoman peasants to pay for grain, the assignat. This was a future promise to pay the bills. The Ottomans had a fixed price for grain, which was the price ceiling that nobody was allowed to sell above. This was paid in gold, which would have been too heavy to carry around and likely would have been stolen by Russian generals. When her army invaded, it was fed by paying above market rates of the Ottomans' own grain using these assignats. This also deprived the Ottoman troops of bread, and thousands of troops deserted or revolted. What backed these assignats if they were not backed by gold? They were backed by the promise of conquered land, that the Ottoman peasants were working for the Sultan. Catherine bought Ottoman bread by paying above market rates, backed by the land she intended to conquer. To put it in context, you show up with a gun to rob a bank and bribe the security guard with the money you are intending to steal. The reason why Americans call the British limeys. Between the 16th and the 18th century, a nasty disease called scurvy plagued sailors, killing roughly 2 million during that time. A surgeon named James Lind, who worked for the Royal Navy, figured out it was due to the sailors' diet. A deadly vitamin C deficiency due to the kind of food being served aboard ships. It became Royal Navy policy to squeeze citrus fruits like limes into their crew's grog to save them from scurvy. As a result, the British would often turn up with full manpower on every ship while other crews were still being devastated by scurvy. The British figured this out in the 18th century, but the Americans didn't end up figuring it out until the next century and were wondering why the British kept trading for all their limes as nobody else ever bought them. There's an article about here if anyone wants to know more. Persian general was stuck besieging a city whose walls were impenetrable. So, unbeknownst to him, one of his high commanders cuts off his own nose and one of his ears. He then goes before the general, who is a bit disturbed, asking why his commander would do this. The commander says that it is part of his plan, and he knew that the general wouldn't be on board with it if he asked first. The commander then informs the general that he will go before the king of the enemy city, and claim that the general did this to him, and that he would like to betray said general for this mutilation. The commander then told the general to send his weakest men to a specific place so that the commander, leading the enemy forces, could win a major victory, solidifying his place with the enemy city. The commander would then take over watch of one of the gates, and simply let in the general's army. Save for a few hiccups, it worked and the city was destroyed. Source: The Histories by Herodotus. I like the propaganda that the British were so accurate in their air attacks because the pilots ate a lot of carrots which improved their vision. That caught on so well that people to this day still believe that eating carrots is good for your eyes. In the War of 1812, the British Canadians were trying to take Detroit but were severely outnumbered. They only had a couple hundred British soldiers, and a few hundred militia and native warriors. They couldn't wait because another American force was on the way. So as they set up camp across the river, they dug trenches, and would march by in full view of the Americans, then duck into the trench and sneak back to march by again. At night they would light extra fires, and at dinner time they would do the same trench trick, the same guys repeatedly lining up to get pretend food. They also gave extra British uniforms to the Canadian militiamen so it looked like there were thousands of British soldiers. The Americans had men but not the supplies or morale to endure a siege against an apparently superior British force. So they surrendered the fort without a fight. In Mexico, a native tribe once destroyed a Spanish attacking force by setting up huge trenches and filling them up with all the peppers they could get their hands on. They proceeded to light on fire, making a toxic smoke that was extremely painful to breath. Chemical warfare. Bye. William of Normandy sent his best cavalry into battle at the middle of the Saxon line. Then suddenly retreat in what seemed like disorganized panic. When they had retreated far enough, the cavalry turned and troops concealed on the two hilltops converged on them. And thus went the Battle of Hastings. The enveloping retreat is very documented and even used as recently as Iraq is. It works because the soldiers on the ground are so focused on the immediate proximity that they don't think they were laying down a pretty solid lick and now they're retreating. This could be a trap. Instead it's just charge. Julius Caesar plan at the Battle of Alesia is so bizarre, can't believe the dude actually pulled off this strategy. During the final act of the war in Gaul, the Romans had the Gauls army and their chieftain Vercingetorix trapped in the town of Alesia. Instead of assaulting the city, Caesar decided to go ahead with a classic siege to starve the enemy. He then decided that a normal siege wasn't enough, so he had his army build a 10 m high wall with watchtowers around the entire city. Perfect plan, right? No one can get out. The city is fenced and lol. Unfortunately, word got out to a second Gaul army that Vercingetorix and his troops were in trouble in Alesia. This army was heading straight for Alesia and was threatening to break the Roman siege. So Julius Caesar had another wild idea. Let's build a second wall around our Roman army and the first wall, so we can block the incoming Gaul army and keep the Alesia siege going. Woot woot. Roman soldiers built that second high wall again in record time, and the Gaul army that was supposed to save Alesia was instead welcomed by insane fortifications. They tried pushing through, but the Roman defeated them thanks to Caesar's super wall. Vercingetorix and his soldiers also tried to break the wall. Couldn't do it. He surrendered to the Romans and Gaul was finally conquered. Lol. I don't know if it's crazy or brutal, but Spanish conquistadors would unleash armored mastiff dogs on the indigenous people. The indigenous people hadn't encountered such large dogs, nor had they seen them in war. The dogs would be unleashed and would tear humans apart. The dogs were large, well-trained, armored, and extremely energetic and enthusiastic when set loose on people. I can't believe no one has mentioned this yet, but Admiral Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British Navy was having a hell of a time getting into an engagement with the French Navy. Then one day, the French finally committed to a battle after sailing out of a Spanish port, with the Spanish Navy at their sides. The total battle line was 27 British ships against 33 ships of the combined French and Spanish navies. The Allied fleet formed a huge defensive line and invited Nelson to try to attack it. Come at me, bro. Now when talking about naval engagements, you'll often hear of the term crossing the T. It was general tactical knowledge at the time that your best bet for winning a naval engagement was to cross the other party's T, basically allowing your own ships to give a maximum broadside to the front ships of your enemy's line formation. Attacking as a line into the teeth of a bunch of broadsides was considered suicidal. But good old Nelson was convinced of the superiority of the British Navy over every other navy in the world, and he was on a bound to prove that sheet. So what did Nelson do? He yelled YOLO and, after dividing his command into two line formations, ducking charged his ships straight at the Allied defense, thus crossing his own T, with his own ship, the HMS Victory, leading one of his two lines. His ship and the other lead British ship took terrible hits, but they reached and broke through the French and Spanish line. But get this, when his two lines broke through, they kept right on sailing, which cut the French and Spanish Navy into three parts, in between his own two lines. Suddenly, the French and Spanish navies were having their own T's crossed, with British ships firing all guns and giving full broadsides in both directions as they sailed right on through to the other side. As the smoke finally started to settle, 22 ships of the Spanish and French navies were destroyed. Not a single British ship was lost that day. Nelson, who died later that day from a bullet wound, and the British Navy sailed into history that day as eternal badasses. Blitzkrieg like it seems pretty meh now, but back when it's first deployed it was unheard of. The concept you would just blow past entire defense lines and hope your supporting units would keep the spearhead from getting cut off. It relied on pure speed and not to get bogged down at risk of the entire breakthrough failing. The Romans besieged a city called Themyscira in modern-day Turkey. The Romans started digging tunnels beneath the city to breach the walls, and the defenders opened the tunnels on their end and released bears and wasps into the tunnels to attack the Romans. Now they lost the battle anyways, but it was not so regardless. Not really a battle tactic, but American usage of shotguns during WW1. The guns used were 12-gauge shotguns that could be fitted with bayonets. Frontline American soldiers used the slam firing technique, during which the trigger is held as the gun is pumped and fired from the hip, resulting in catastrophic injuries or death to anyone on the receiving end. The trench shotgun was so devastatingly effective that it spurred the German government to send an unusual request to Washington on September 19, 1918, calling for the weapon's removal from combat. In the first Gulf War in 1991, the Iraqis piled up a large berm, 3-4 meters high, in front of their forward trenches. The intent was that they would shoot the vulnerable bottoms of the coalition tanks when they drove over. Somebody in the 5-sided funhouse decided to mount bulldozer blades on the tanks. They pushed the dirt into the trenches, burying the Iraqi soldiers before driving over their graves. A lot of the shit they tried in WW2. The Nazis tried to train dogs to be racist, balloons floating to the coast of the US, and bats strapped with bombs. But even the stuff we view as normal was ducking insane. Kamikaze attacks is the definition of insanity, even in context of the time. Nukes? That's also insane. They split the atom even though we weren't even entirely sure what the duck it was gonna do. They thought it had the chance to cause a cascading effect and literally burn the atmosphere away, ending the planet. These tactics actually made battle safer for the soldiers. The colors made the different units recognizable to their generals, so they could order them to the correct areas. Fire rates were extremely low, precision of the muskets too. The biggest chance to hit an enemy unit was to keep your guys as close together as possible, thus you march them in a slow pace in a tight formation, so they don't have to sort themselves. If the enemy fires back, you basically got 1 minute to charge them, well possible at a fighting distance of 100 yards, because they are reloading. Again, a tight pack of soldiers is the best option to break up an opposing unit in a charge. Looks crazy from today's POV, but it makes sense considering the weapon and means of communication at these times. Karelian war tactics during the reign of Carolus Rex in the Swedish Empire. They'd wait until they saw the white in the eye of their enemies before firing their weapons, and wouldn't stop for enemy fire based on the premise that God decided whether you got to live or die anyway. Germany knocked out Russia during WWI by putting Lenin, among others, on a sealed train car and sending him there. This was soon followed by the Bolshevik Revolution, neutralizing the country's ability to wage war, and the eventual rise of the USSR. To be fair, the Russian Empire was on its last leg at this time. Literally catapulting plague corpses over walls. How the plague spread to Italy in 1334. An epidemic which would eventually kill 2/3 of China's inhabitants struck the northeastern Chinese province of Hopari, claiming up to 90% of the population, some 5 million people. Carried along trade routes, the Black Death, as it would soon be called, began to work its way west, striking India, Syria, and Mesopotamia. In 1346, the plague came to Kaffa, a Genoese cathedral city and a port central to the successful Genoese trade industry located on the Crimean peninsula of the Black Sea. The Tartar forces of Kipchak Khan Janibeg, backed by Venetian forces competitors of the Genoese, had laid siege to Kaffa in hopes of removing the Genoese from one of the cornerstones of Europe's defense against Eastern attack and Genoa's dominance of east-west trade. Kaffa was helpless, barely able to sustain even the crudest living conditions. Finding its chief means of supplies cut off, Kaffa spent the next year watching itself decline into a hopeless state. But then, in 1347, to the Italians' delight, their opponents began to die off at an alarming rate. Janibeg's army was overcome by the plague. Janibeg had no choice but to call off his siege, but not until he performed one last act of warfare against Genoa. Using the catapults designed to throw boulders and fireballs over the walls of fortified cities like Kaffa, Janibeg launched the plague-infested corpses of his dead men into the city. The Italians quickly dumped these bodies back into the sea, but the damage was done. Due to the squalid conditions forced upon Kaffa by the siege, it was ripe for the quick desolation of the plague. Hoping to escape the quickly spreading disease, 4 Genoese ships, thought to be untainted, departed from Kaffa. They sailed home to Italy,